I'm going to show you the EMG and breathing application, which is a step up in complexity from the basic EMG application because it shows you two measured parameters at once. That's the EMG, or the muscle tension, plus a measure of breathing. Now, the breathing is actually measured using a temperature probe placed just below the nostril that measures the difference between the inhaled and exhaled air. Now, I'll say more about that in the hardware setup video elsewhere. So yes, it's the main advantage of using the EMG with breathing application is if you're a chest breather, if you show a pattern of chest-based breathing, which I've talked about in the videos. So in chest-based breathing, you can see a rhythm in the EMG signal. It rises and falls in step with the breathing, and the EMG plus breathing application really draws that out because it shows you the two parameters together. Now, as I say, it is a step up in complexity, and there is a danger of sort of overcomplicating things. It's not necessary to use this application, and you've got to make a decision about whether you want to or not, because the danger is that it's too much of a learning curve and you might not want to bother with it. But it could be useful if you are a chest breather. Okay, so the application does introduce derived parameters to do with the breath. So the obvious one is breathing rate. So it's often interesting to see what your breathing rate is and how it varies. And another one that can be interesting at times is the inhalation to exhalation ratio. So this is the time ratio between the durations, or the relative durations, of the inhalation and exhalation. That's sometimes interesting. As always, the starting point is the platform program. Here we are. I'm double clicking to start, and then now just a point about device setup. So on the setup tab here, if I click device setup, now for this application there are two parameters to make sure that you've got the source set right. So the first is the EMG. Currently I've got it set to the simulator, and I'm going to leave it like that for the purposes of the software demonstration. And secondly, the breath parameter. So if you've got a rental device to GP8, it can measure both of those, so you would select GP8 in each of those. But I'm going to leave it on simulator. I'm going to click OK, and then I'm going to go back to the EMG tab. We've looked at the EMG basic application, and the EMG and breathing application is a set of 3 buttons to the right of the screen here. So the first button is going to launch the application, and then the next one generates a session report, and then the third one generates an application report, which means a report of all the sessions that you've done, which is worthwhile perhaps once you've built up at least several sessions. You've also got a link to the user guide, which is a document explaining the workings of the application. Let's launch the EMG and breathing application. I'm clicking this button here. Again, I'm using the simulator mode, so I'm just accepting there, and the application starts up. So it's using BioEra again, just like the EMG basic application. Takes a few seconds. And here we are, here's the interface. I'm pressing play to start the flow of data. And we see the signals here. Now they'll take a few seconds to adjust. Now perhaps the first thing to say is that the breathing signal, as I've said, it's measured as a temperature signal, and the software has to calibrate. So it actually takes 25 seconds, just over 20 seconds actually, before it will look like a proper breathing signal. But now, here in this short-term display, we've got the breathing signal displaying as you'd sort of expect. So what's happening is it's going up and down. Here it's going up, and that's when I'm breathing in. And then breathing out again, it goes down again. Breathing in, up, breathing out, down. So that's what you've got with the breath signal. It just goes on like that as you breathe. The other signal, which is magenta in this chart is the EMG, and you can see that it sort of looks synchronized. That's what happens in chest breathing. The chest tightens up and the shoulders tighten up, and the EMG signal rises on the in-breath, and then they relax again, the same muscles relax again on the out-breath there, and it comes down. So that's what chest breathing looks like. Now, if you're abdominally breathing, and this is assuming that you're using the wrist placement, then that placement doesn't detect the abdominal movements. So the line is more or less flat. It's never perfectly flat, but it doesn't show that clear rhythm that it does right now. So yeah, those are the two parameters. Now we've got one range or scale at the left of the chart. It goes 0 to 6. That is actually for the EMG measurement. So it's just the same units as before in the basic EMG application. The breath signal, well, it doesn't really matter what the units are. So there's no scale that can be had from the breath. All you want to see from the breath is the up and down movements. So that's essentially the short-term display. It's analogous to the basic EMG application, but it has two signals. Okay, now I'll just mention at this point in the simulator recording, it's getting more like an abdominal breathing. So it's the line is much flatter. So there's no clear rhythm. Okay, moving on to the rest of the interface, we've got in the lower half of the screen, we've got this long-term display, which whilst the short-term takes, well, it's set to a minute and a half. That'll take a minute and a half for the traces to go right across. This one, it takes about, well, it's set to currently 10 minutes. Yeah, so this will take 10 minutes to get across. So it's much slower, and we've got, it's more complex because we've got 4 signals here, 4 traces shown, and they are sort of calculated parameters. So the blue one is the breathing rate. Now that's also shown in these numeric displays right at the bottom. So the blue one, they're all color coded. Blue is for breathing rate. So you've got the instantaneous breathing rate and the average breathing rate. That's averaged over 1 minute. Then the red is the inhalation to exhalation ratio, or the time ratio between the inhalation phase of the breath and the exhalation phase. Now, this is often interesting because, well, a good relaxed breathing, generally the inhalation to exhalation ratio is less than 1, which means that the inhalation is shorter than the exhalation. The exhalation is more drawn out, takes longer. Yeah, that's for a relaxed breathing. It's not always like that. So if yours is about 1, then they're about even. If it's above 1, maybe you could be more relaxed in your breathing. So it's often interesting to have a look at that. What you'll see in the simulator mode is that the average tends to go to about, well, it tends to be less than 1. Now it's sort of 0.7, 0.6, 0.8, that sort of range. Now we've got 2 more traces in the long-term display. They are is called the minimum EMG, which is in the pale pink color, and then the maximum EMG. What that means is that the software calculates the minimum EMG and the maximum EMG, or the peak EMG, over the cycle of 1 breath. Yeah, so it's relating that very much to breath. So it's min and max per breath. Hope that makes sense. So that can sometimes be useful to track because if there's a clear chest-based breathing, then the maximum can be a lot higher, or noticeably higher than the minimum. So you can see it in the early part of the recording. The maximum, which is the darker coloured, the sort of magenta trace, is higher than the lighter pink trace, which is the minimum EMG. So that's the long-term display. Now, we've also got numeric displays for the inhalation to exhalation ratio, the EMG itself, and then the maximum EMG and minimum EMG, and then something called chest score, which is, I'm not going to go too much into that, but essentially it's a measure of how strong the chest component of breathing is. So the more that you are chest breathing, the higher the chest score. It's really showing you the same information as the difference between the minimum and maximum EMG signals, from which it's actually derived. So that can be useful just to sort of have a look at that, get a sense of that. Now the rest of the controls are to do with audio feedback, and in particular we have two thresholds. We've got one that's associated with EMG on this side and one that's associated with breathing on this side. I'm not going to say anything more about that until I talk about the audio feedback, which is where threshold-based feedback really comes into play. You can, of course, fine-tune the displays or adjust the displays. So let's start with the short-term display. There are two controls, this one and this one, which control firstly the EMG range, which is the vertical range for the magenta EMG signal. So at the moment it's set to 6 microvolts. If I set that down to 4, I've reduced the scale, I've got greater sensitivity now, so that can be a useful thing to do. So it's showing 0 to 4 on the vertical scale there. The other control is perhaps less important. It's the horizontal or the time scale for the short-term period there. It's again, it's a combo box control. You can make it longer or shorter. I'm not going to change that right now. Okay, for the long-term display, we've got equivalent controls, but this time it's more complex because we've got more traces shown in the display. So let's start with the easy one. The horizontal scale or the time scale is this control here. So it's combo box again, set by default to 10 minutes. You can change that, you can make it longer or shorter. Now the other controls are the range for the breathing, sorry, the range for the EMG signal. So it by default is set 0 to 10. You can change that. For example, you can make it go smaller or larger, or back to somewhere in the middle at 10. Now you can see that the numbers shown on the vertical scale for the long-term chart do in fact reflect the EMG trace and not the other ones currently, but I can change that. So for example, if I want to see the breathing rate, then I can click on the blue button there, and now I've got 0 to 20, which applies only to the blue breathing rate trace. So I can change that using this control. Again, it's a combo box. I can make it lower. So the blue trace shifted upwards because I've made the scale more sensitive, or I can make it larger or somewhere in the middle. So that's the breathing rate range control. That's essentially it. One thing I forgot to mention about the EMG range control is that it applies to the maximum and minimum EMG traces both. Now there is no range control for the red trace, which is the inhalation to exhalation ratio. That's, if I click on the red box there, then I get the default scale, which is 0 to 2. So one on that scale, where there's actually a bold line across the middle of the display, that means at that point the inhalation and exhalations are equal. So it's 50-50. So anything below that, and the inhalation is shorter, the exhalation is longer. Anything above that line, the exhalation tends to be, it will be shorter. Now again, just to repeat what I said earlier, when the when the ratio is less than 1 and the inhalation is shorter, that tends to go with relaxed breathing. So relaxed breathing, the exhalation tends to be drawn out. So that's something that you can have a look at. Is the red trace generally below that line? That's always interesting to have a look at. Okay, that's essentially it. I think, one thing I forgot to mention about the short-term display is that you can't change the scale for the breath, because that's always sort of relative anyway. There should be no reason that you'd want to change it anyway. So just to make things somewhat simpler, it's fixed. Now the rest of the controls are to do with really audio feedback, so I'll cover those in another video. I want to return to the process of breathing calibration, which, to repeat, is that when you start the EMG and breathing application, is that the breath signal, which is the sort of yellow-green one in the short-term display, doesn't display properly. It's just going up and down. It's off the screen. It's off the bottom. It takes 20 seconds, just over 20 seconds, for the software to calibrate to your breath, after which time the breath trace displays as it should do. Now during this time, during this 20-second period, you need to breathe normally, evenly, not too slowly, for the calibration process to be able to happen. Now another thing that relates to this is that you may not have noticed, but there is a second window that starts when you start the EMG and breathing application, and it looks like this. I'm just going to get it up. Here it is. I've got it in front now. Now this is known as the support window, and it shows the breath, the raw trace that's coming out from the device here. So it's going up and down as you breathe in and out. And well, the key thing perhaps on this display is that there's a button called calibrate, which you can press at any point if you think that the calibration process hasn't happened. Now in this case I know that it has happened, because this second chart here, the second one down from the top, it actually shows the rate of change of the temperature signal. But don't worry about that, that's a technical detail. But it should sort of look like this. You should have these two dotted lines round about through the middle of this trace. Yeah, so not too close to the center and not too far out towards the edges. Now those two lines, again, I don't want to go into the technical details because there's really no need, but they are the basis for calculating the turning points of the breath, which is where it turns around at the top of the breath, the beginning of the inhalation and the beginning of the exhalation. So the two breath turning points. So the software needs to calculate those accurately in order to work out the parameters like the breathing rate and the inhalation to exhalation ratio. So that's about it. That's what you need to look for if there are problems. Mostly it'll just work and you'll never need to have a look at the support window, but it should essentially look like that. And you should also see a sort of square wave in this third chart. So this one's showing exhalation is during the high phase of the square wave and inhalation is during the low phase. So that's what that's all about. Yeah, again, calibrate button, that's the main thing. If you need to kind of redo it, if there's a problem with with how the breath signal looks, you can press calibrate. When you finished a session, you can view a report of that session to see how you did over the whole session. So you click this button. It's the second one down on the right hand side of the screen for the EMG tab on the platform program. So I'm going to click that once. Now first thing that happens is I get a dialog offering me to select a session. Now in my case there's only one session there. It's a new installation, so I've only got one to select. So click OK there. And now another dialog, this time it's options for the report. So we've seen this briefly for the basic EMG application, and I'll say a little bit more about it here. So we've got the same option to add notes to the report. So if I check that box, it would offer me a dialog to write in some notes. So if you wanted to give some notes to remind yourself what it was all about, then you could do that. I'll say something about this other option here. If I check that, then it overwrites any existing report. Now what that means is it might not make a lot of sense at first, but let's say that you created a report and then you decided that you want to go back and change the options. Well, the second time that you click the button, you have to overwrite the existing report to have the new options apply. Otherwise the software will just find the existing report and open it as a file. So that's the relevance of that option there. Now we've got a couple of tabs here, EMG and breathing. Basically I can use these controls to sort of set a maximum in this case, or sometimes a minimum, so that I can filter out sort of blips in the data. So for example, let's say that during my session one breath happened to be very fast because I sniffed or something like that, and it was a short breath and it was way above the rest of the breaths for that session. So I could exclude that from my report by setting a maximum on the breathing rate. So that's the kind of thing that you can do. I'm just going to go with the defaults for simplicity. So I'm going to select OK. And again, just like before with the basic EMG application, the software generates the report as an HTML file, which means that it opens in a web browser. In my case, Google Chrome is my default browser, so it's opened in that. But it doesn't mean that it's on the internet. It's just a file on your local computer. So here's the session report. Let's see what we've got. This time it's more elaborate, it's more useful, it's more interesting than for the basic EMG application where we just had one measure for the EMG through the session. This time we've got breathing rate, and then we've got the inhalation to exhalation ratio, and then the maximum and minimum EMG per breath. So that's like the peak and the lowest point over the cycle of each breath in the EMG or muscle tension signal. Then lastly, we've got a chart for the chest score, which is really a measure for how strong the chest breathing component is. Yeah, when you're abdominally breathing, the chest score is minimal, it's very low. Now these are arbitrary numbers, so it's difficult to tell, but you'll get a sense of that, of what it means to be high and low, if you sort of progress with the application, if you start to use it regularly. But basically the same information is encoded in this graph, which is the difference between the peak, which is the darker purple color, and the lighter purple color, which is the minimum. So if there's a big gap, then there's a big chest component, yeah, or a big rhythm in the EMG trace that goes with the breath. Hope that makes sense. Okay, so let's go back to the top. Breathing rate, we've got one data point per breath, and this was a shortish session, about 6 minutes. We started off breathing at around about an average-ish rate, at about 12, something like that, and then we slowed down, the breathing slowed down, and then it sped up again here to something like 16, 17. That's actually me doing a sort of deliberate speeding up. Most of your sessions are not going to look so sort of clear cut like that. So I speed up, and then I've slowed down my breath again, even to one point, very slow at around maybe just 2 breaths. That might even be an artifact of the software. That might be a miscalculation of the breath. The software might have missed one breath and counted 2 breaths as one very slow breath. That might have happened there. So then I've sped up again, back up to about 10 for the rest of the session. Now, inhalation to exhalation ratio, you can see again the reminder that the 1 is a significant point, because that's 50-50 between the inhalation and exhalation. So on the line, the inhalation is the same length as the exhalation, or the same duration. Anything below the line, the inhalation is shorter, which you get with relaxed breathing. You tend to get that with relaxed breathing. Yeah, so watch out for that red line being ideally predominantly below the line, but it's not something that you necessarily have to sort of train. It would ordinarily just kind of come out that way. But if it happens to show that it's above the line, or predominantly above the line, then it's something that you could bring your attention to for later training sessions. Okay, so that's a session report. You've also got the data in a table form, so you can see, for example, the average or the mean breathing rate over this session was 10.7 breaths per minute. Okay, that's more or less all there is to say. I can close that down. The session report does now exist on your computer as an HTML file, which you can actually open independently if you want, or even you could email it to somebody. Okay, that's session report. The application report, I'm not going to say anything about that here because I currently don't have enough sessions to make it worthwhile. I'll talk about that later on in later modules of the course.